everyone. Thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it. We know time is limited lately, so thank you all for coming. My name's Anahita Mohtasham-Gharagozloo. I am the managing editor of the German Law Journal. And this is Jack Andrade, my partner and the executive editor of the German Law Journal. We are so lucky to have Mr. O'Brien with us today. He is a State Department Foreign Service Officer, and he is a former U.S. Army Special Operations Officer. He has served at embassies and on assignments in Russia, China, Sweden, Germany, Estonia, Afghanistan, and countries in Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and the Southern Caucasus. He has an MBA from Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management, and he's also worked in the private sector in France and South Korea. Mr. O'Brien's most recent assignment was to lead the State Department Global Engagement Center's efforts to counter Russian disinformation, which is part of what we will be talking about today. And he speaks French, Russian, Mandarin, Swedish, and German. Thank you so much. So I'm going to hand it off to you now.
Great. Thank you. And thank you to the leadership of the Law School of Washington and Lee for hosting me today. Special thanks to Dean Helwig. And special thanks to you, Anahita and Jack, and to Will Cheskis, my colleague and fellow traveler from China, for organizing this discussion. I appreciate everyone carving out the time today to join in virtually. I know that you're busy with studies or with work or with preparing for classes. So thank you very much for that. And I hope that you and your families are remaining safe and healthy during these challenging times. As Anahita pointed out, I am a State Department Foreign Service Officer. That means I'm a diplomat, and I work in embassies overseas, advancing U.S. policies and maintaining relationships with foreign governments. My last assignment was here in Washington, D.C. With the Global Engagement Center. I'm actually in the process of retiring at this point, and that's why I'm in a position where I'll be speaking on these issues. I'm speaking in my civilian capacity, but the issues that I talk about today are ones that were gleaned during my time with the Global Engagement Center, which is basically an interagency organization that's part of the Department of State. And its job is to basically identify, understand, and expose disinformation that's created on by state actors and is designed to harm the United States and our allies' interests. So I'm here today to talk about disinformation in the digital information space and how state actors use it against us, and why it's important that we know how to recognize it, how to counter it, and perhaps even talk a little bit about what's going to happen and where we see the future of all of this going. Now, the main purveyors of disinformation in the world, state-sponsored, that is, are Russia, China, and Iran. At least that's from the Global Engagement Center, the GEC's perspective. And we're definitely their number one target, and so are our allies, and so are our interests around the world. Now, malign state actors like Moscow and Beijing, and by the way, when I say Moscow and Beijing, what I'm really referring to is the governments of these countries, not the people. So if I say Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, what I really mean are the regimes and the governments there. So malign state actors like Moscow and Beijing, they've been weaponizing information for decades, even if the technologies that are being employed now are new. So in the past, for example, Russia, the Soviet Union actually started a disinformation campaign that the United States developed HIV and deployed it in Africa, specifically to keep populations down, and it was apparently to target the gay populations in America. And this was not true, obviously. It was an absolute piece of disinformation, but it's something that we've seen over the years come out of Moscow. It's just that now, before they focused on propaganda and they dallied in disinformation, but the development of social media and the vast ability to reach entire countries and populations as quickly as they can do now makes it easier to create and spread outright lies, and so they're going with that. But I want to make sure that we're clear on terms, because these terms have been used kind of incorrectly, and that's really because this is a new area. So let's talk about the difference between propaganda, disinformation, and even misinformation. So propaganda is the act of arranging or organizing information in such a way as to bring out a perception that would not normally be held if the facts were presented in a straightforward way. Now, I'll give you an example. a few years ago, a few decades ago, actually, the Russian and the U.S. Olympic crew teams were engaged in a race. They raced each other. There were no other competitors in the race. The U.S. team won. And the headline in the Russian state media outlet Sputnik read, "Russian rowing team takes second place in international contest. U.S. team finishes next to last." So that's propaganda. It's factually correct. But if you organize it in a certain way, it makes it look like the Russians at least made the podium and the U.S. put in a terrible performance, when in fact the opposite was actually true. That's propaganda. Disinformation, on the other hand, is when a person or a group deliberately creates and spreads a lie in order to harm another person or a group. So an example of this would be the US military created COVID-19 as a bioweapon in a lab in the country of Georgia, and then brought it to Wuhan in China and released it on the population. Now that's disinformation, and that actually was put out there by a Russian state-aligned proxy website that ultimately ended up being spoken from the podium of the spokesperson for the Chinese Ministry of Interior. So a Chinese government official actually spoke that line. That's disinformation, because they know that's not true, and the people who created it know it is absolutely has no basis in truth. Now, there's another term, misinformation, and that's when the speaker actually, sometimes people use that when they mean disinformation. So misinformation is when someone like mistakenly passes on information they think is true, but it's actually false. Like when a friend or a relative forwards you an email that contains an urban legend, which they think is real, or maybe an alternative cure for some ailment, or maybe even COVID-19, and that cure is actually harmful. The content might be a lie, or could even really truly be harmful, but the intention of the sender was not to lie or to harm you. That's misinformation. In this world, we call those people useful idiots. It's not meant to be insulting to them, but it actually is it's a Russian term, meaning you can actually get people to manipulate them and actually get them to spread your disinformation when they don't even realize they're doing it. Now, Russia and China and Iran do not deal in misinformation, and their intentions are definitely not benign. They deliberately disseminate lies that are intended to be harmful. But their goals for disinformation are actually distinctly different. The Kremlin tries to disrupt the current world order to accomplish its own goals. Beijing seeks to deliberately reshape the current world order to its own advantage. And that's those are different goals, and those are different purposes, and they take on different methodologies. The Russian disinformation and propaganda ecosystem is designed to weaken countries that Russia sees as threats by manipulating their information environments in nefarious ways, specifically by polarizing domestic political conversations and attempting to destroy the public's faith in good governance, in independent media, and democratic principles. And I'm sure that sounds familiar to you all in some of the discussions that are taking place around what's happening in our own domestic political situation right now, and especially as we have an election coming up tomorrow. The Russian disinformation and propaganda system seeks to exploit those seams in our societies, not just the United States society, but societies and countries across Europe as well. This includes a range of activities, official statements, state-funded media putting out disinformation, coordinated online campaigns. There's false social media personas, literally people you think might be someone that supports a white supremacist group or a leftist a leftist group like Antifa or someone like that is actually a Russian intelligence officer with an online persona that's false, attempting to manipulate your point of view on certain things. Now, COVID has demonstrated that it's almost become the disinformation on steroids, because the entire world is affected by COVID. The entire world is interested in vaccines and cures for it. And so it's become a great playing ground for Russia to put out all types of disinformation about the vaccine, about cures, about the origin of it, and about what the US and our allies are doing to stop the spread of COVID. Beijing takes a totally different approach. It deploys totally comprehensive, coordinated, whole of government influence campaigns to promote the Communist Party's narratives that it is a benign, positive, and non-interventionist power. That's a total whole of government approach to doing this. And it's about having you see what the Communist Party of China's intentions are as opposite of what they actually are. And during the period of COVID, because China was actually responsible for the start of the virus and for its spread worldwide, Beijing has gone into high gear promoting disinformation around it because really, truly, their reputation is on the line. Iran's goals are a little similar to Russia's, but only on a regional scale. They attempt to sow discord and mistrust in Iraq, especially between the Kurdish people and other groups, and in Syria and elsewhere in the Middle East. And that's in an effort to advance their goal of becoming the dominant regional power in the Middle East. A few other things I want to talk about with dissemination, disinformation. It's important to note that you cannot stop all disinformation. It's a waste of resources to argue every lie, and sometimes it's counterproductive to engage it because it actually gives the disinformation lie, the fake news, the attention that the adversary craves to give it. But certain critical disinformation has to be confronted, like on something that has a global impact like COVID-19 or on major elections in countries. It's also important to note that creating and disseminating disinformation for these countries that I've mentioned, Russia, China, and Iran, is a key pillar of their national military strategies. So in other words, it's official policy to create lies about the United States and about our allies. There are units in their militaries, in their information, and in their intelligence apparatus that are well-resourced, and they're actively engaging in this activity. That doesn't exist in the United States. It doesn't exist in NATO countries. It doesn't exist in allied countries. They don't have active disinformation efforts targeted at who we see as our adversaries, but our adversaries do. Now, why do they go to such effort to spread lies about us and harm us through disinformation? I've been looking at this for a long time, and I think simply put, they just have a vastly different and darker vision of how the world should work. And they're about trying to make it go that way. I would say that the Kremlin and Tehran want to control our countries since no one's really buying their ideas. And as a result, they have to lie about ours. The Chinese Communist Party simply believes that the world order should exist to serve them. And I think Will can tell you, Will Chaskus from our time in China together, that is the dominant point of view about China, that they have the Communist Party there believes it is almost their natural right to dominate the world. In fact, the word China in Chinese, Zhongguo, actually it means Middle Kingdom, and that actually translates to center of the world. And that's how they see themselves. So why is it important to be able to recognize and counter state-sponsored disinformation? Well, first of all, it's targeting you. And so you should understand what you're dealing with so that you're not manipulated. And also because believing it can lead you to have views or take actions that are based on false premises and could be harmful. It's also, a lot of times I hear it from my friends and family and people I work with, they say, we don't even read the news anymore because it's pointless. We don't have no idea what to believe. And I can understand that frustration, but choosing to disengage from all information out of a sense of helplessness is also not the answer. Because free speech is an inalienable right in our society and other societies, and we should cherish it and we should nurture it. So, at least in my opinion. So whether we're disinformed or we're uninformed, either way, the bad guys win. It's our responsibility to stay informed, and that presents many challenges. Because how do you notice the difference between? How do you know when you're reading disinformation or when you're reading real information? And that just really comes down to striving to develop critical thinking skills rather than just accepting what you read. And every time something confirms your bias, ask yourself, what if I were on the other side? Think about it differently. Would this look like it made sense if I were on the other side? Now, in diplomacy, we always strive to understand our counterparts' underlying interests and their motivations in order to make sense of their position. So if you want to know what someone's position is, think about what their interests might be. So in that vein, I'd like to step back a little bit and go through some of the historical antecedents that have brought us to where we are today in our relationships with these three countries, and perhaps shed some light on some of the reasons of why they do what they do. So this will be a little bit of a history lesson, but it'll be kind of a history lesson with a bit of my own personal experiences involved, since I have a lot of experience dealing with Russia, dealing with Central and Eastern Europe and with China and other parts of the world, and a bit of experience with Iran as well. So I've been dealing with the Russians since I was a 23-year-old US Army platoon leader, patrolling the East German border in the final chapter of the Cold War. So let's start with them. As many of us know, but not all of us, the US and the UK and Communist Russia were actually allies at one point, and that was during World War II. In the fight to defeat Nazi Germany, which had invaded Russia, we all worked together. But then following World War II, Russia began cutting itself off from the West and took an increasingly adversarial position towards the US and our allies. And for several decades following World War II, Moscow expanded and imposed its model of communism and socialism on countries all the way from the Baltic states in Northern Europe through the former Yugoslavia, what we now know as the Balkans, on down to the Southern Caucasus countries of Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. This whole era was actually called the Cold War as we know it. We all know that. At its height, Soviet Russia occupied all of Central and Eastern Europe. They owned half of Germany. They bordered Iran, and they controlled almost all of Central Asia. So invading all the countries around it, cutting off relations with the West, cutting off access to Western influence inside the Soviet Union, and engaging the race with the West to build up nuclear weapons was kind of the relationship that we had with Russia all the way up until 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed. Many factors led to the decline of the Soviet model and the end of the Cold War, the failed war in Afghanistan, and the exhausted Soviet economy, and just general dissatisfaction internally from on the part of the subjugated countries. In 1989, the Berlin Wall collapsed. It was one of the greatest symbols of the Soviet Union, and it was literally torn down with sledgehammers and with people's hands. Citizens of both East and West Berlin flooded the wall and pulled it apart. And then in 1990, the Soviet Union collapsed, and Russia's empire that had strived for decades to build was just gone in the blink of an eye. The Boris Yeltsin era followed in Russia in the 1990s, and that was characterized by a failed attempt to establish a real democracy. It was the rise of the oligarchs, something that no one had ever heard of before. It might have been a term that was available, but no one used it. These were robber barons who took control of great chunks of national wealth through corruption, coercion, and outright murder. Economic chaos, the collapse of the ruble, totally gutted military, a war in Chechnya that was a complete failure for the Russian military. And in fact, the Russian security apparatus was in such tatters that at one point, a German teenager was able to fly a single-engine plane across Russian airspace, completely undetected, and land in Red Square in the middle of Moscow. So this is the mighty Soviet Union had gotten to this point by 1999. And at that point, the Russians were so fed up with this chaos and humiliation that they were willing to elect a totally unknown based on the vague promise of strong leadership. And that is how former KGB mid-level officer Vladimir Putin came to power. Putin wasn't always a strong figure as when he comes off as today. In fact, at his inauguration ceremony, witnesses described him as so nervous that his hands were shaking as he was holding the paper to deliver his remarks. He had a good reason to be nervous. He took over a country that was under enormous debt to the West for loans during the Yeltsin era, and which had an undeveloped economy that was totally undiversified, 3 industries only: weapons, oil and gas, and basically every other natural resource that you can cut off the side of a mountain or pull out of the ground. Those 3 industries remain to be the only parts of the Russian economy today. In 2003, Putin was so concerned that if the US military went into Iraq, the price of oil would drop below $40 a barrel, which would mean that Russia couldn't service even the interest on their debt and at the same time heat their houses in the winter. Now, I know this because I was in the room with our ambassador when Putin's chief of staff, Sergei Yastrzemski, actually told us that. And that was prior to us going into the war in Iraq in 2003. Now, as we all know, the war didn't turn out that way, and the price of the barrel of oil skyrocketed, and it stayed there for a long time. And that was the turning point for Putin. And that's how he became the strong person, strong leader that he is today. Through oil riches, he was able to rebuild the military somewhat, enough that they could bully their neighbors. He was able to keep his oligarchs allies happy. He was able to crush any of his adversaries. And he was also able to provide for ordinary Russians just enough so that they would look the other way as he steadily deconstructed the country and got himself reelected to office over and over again. But without a diversified economy, which remains today undiversified, Russia still can't compete on a major scale with the developed world. All goods and services in the United States and the European Union are the largest trading relationship in the world. And at the time, during the aughts, the 2000s, China was on the ascendant. Their GDP growth was double digits, and it was clear that they were coming. And so Putin realized that the Russian economy couldn't compete with these economies. And his basic foreign policy posture became, well, if we can't have it, then we're going to make sure you can't have it. And ever since then, it's the foreign policy goals have been to make as much trouble as you can for Western democracies. They become experts at taking the West to the brink of kinetic action in the response to their moves and then backing off for a time. And some of these examples include invading and taking over parts of Georgia and Ukraine. Neither Georgia or Ukraine are NATO members. So are we really going to be able to put together a global coalition or a regional coalition to kick the Russians out? Are we going to drop the 82nd Airborne on them for invading Crimea? The Russians gambled that we wouldn't, and they were right. And probably we shouldn't have. So it's probably a good move. They've done massive cyber attacks against Estonia. They've poisoned dissidents and enemies abroad, and they've engaged in other lesser acts of annoyance like providing asylum for Edward Snowden. So one of the tools that Russia uses to harass Western democracies on all times on a constant basis is basically disinformation, and the development of the digital information space makes that possible to do so on an unprecedented scale. So disinformation is their constant tool to keep Western democracies and economies and politicians and anyone that they see as an adversary on the back foot and reacting. In my role at the Global Engagement Center, we recently published something called the Russian Pillars Report. I'll talk about that in the second half of my presentation, but in it we described that Russia has operationalized the concept of perpetual adversarial competition in the information environment by encouraging the development of what we call a disinformation ecosystem that allows for varied and kind of overlapping approaches that reinforce each other, even when messages within the system appear contradictory, because what it does is it creates confusion and it creates a lack of belief in even what is absolutely verifiably factually true. So the ecosystem reflects both the sources of disinformation and the tactics that the channels use. When we say sources and pillars, we mean one pillar is official government statements that may or may not be true. There's state-funded media outlets like RT and Sputnik, and then there's proxy websites, which are ones that don't claim their connection to the Russian government, Russian intelligence services, but we actually happen to know that they are connected. There are bots, there's false social media personas that I explained earlier. There's cyber-enabled disinformation operations. One of them you may remember is when the Democratic National Committee and the Clinton campaign of 2016, their emails were hacked and released. That was a Russian cyber-enabled disinformation operation. Now it was a cyber-enabled operation that put that information out into the street. It doesn't mean that the information wasn't true, but it wasn't the Democratic DNC's interest and desire to want to have that information out there. These are some of the tactics that the Russians use, and they use them interchangeably, and they use them across the spectrum. And a lot of times what they do is they create these disinformation storms. Recently in Chile, in the middle of an election and some demonstrations around an election, suddenly IP addresses that last week were interested in French yellow vests, and the week before were interested in issues in Norway. Suddenly they all mobbed on the social media conversation around in Chile in Spanish around this election. That's inorganic. That does not make sense. It doesn't make sense that a bunch of groups that are interested only in political issues around the world suddenly would storm on one place, create tensions that would lead to riots, and then disappear and go somewhere else next, like Bolivia or Nigeria. So these kind of IP addresses are basically Russian intelligence operations, and we track them and we try to give governments advance warning that this kind of thing is happening, so they can do their best to prepare for the disinformation, at the very least understand it. So it's great that Russia does this, because it's a very effective tactic on the part of Russia, because once they storm or they mob one area and disappear, they've moved on, the damage is done, and you're just left to pick up the pieces and try to track them. but they're on to the next drama. They're on to the next crisis around the world. So with COVID-19, they've been very opportunistic. They've used this global pandemic as a hook to push all of their longstanding disinformation and propaganda narratives, and to push the narrative that the United States created this and released it on the world, especially to try to destroy the Chinese economy. So that's Russia. I'd like to talk a little bit about China. The Communist Party of China came into being as a result of the Japanese occupation of China during World War II. At the time, there were two groups in China that had very different views of how the country should be. The nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, believed they should be more like a Western democracy with a market economy. The communists, led by Mao Zedong, believed the country should be communist and it should be agrarian. But they had the problem of being occupied by the Japanese of the country. Neither of them were in control of the country. The Japanese were, so there had to be a decision to get rid of them. And the nationalists decided to fight the Japanese out of the country. The communists decided to wait them out, and they took to the mountains in Yan'an and waited out the, let the nationalists do all the fighting. The nationalists succeeded in battling the Japanese out of the country, but they pretty much exhausted themselves in the process. So seeing this, Mao and his groups kind of swooped down out of the hills and they took over. And the nationalists were forced to flee to Taiwan, where they basically subjugated the poor Taiwanese people, but they also set up a democracy with a free market economy, and they established relations with the West. And that's why we and other countries have a mutually supportive relationship with Taiwan today. Now, on mainland China during this time, China had went through several chapters of unpleasantry, mass starvation, subjugation of ethnic groups, slow economic growth, and sometimes backsliding due to bad decisions. And then eventually the relations were normalized with the United States and with the West, and China opened up their economy. Over the course of the next couple of decades, it grew to be what we know it to be now. Now, the way to understand China now, I always say, is through the lens of scale. Huge population, huge landmass, huge market potential, double-digit GDP growth, if not double-digit now, single-digit, but still impressive. But with all of this hugeness comes huge problems. So China's got a complete mismatch in natural endowments where there's arable land where there's no water, there's water where there's no arable land, there's incredible water pollution, incredible air pollution, there's massive unemployment of young college graduates due to poorly thought out education policies about a decade ago, maybe about 15 years ago now. There's an exploding elderly sector with nowhere near the healthcare systems in place to take care of them. Majorly over-leveraged banking sector where at this point loans are being written to service the interest on bad loans, which were issued to service the interest on bad loans. And that just can't go on forever. And the cities that were built out of nowhere, the satellite cities that were tacked onto the existing cities, they were all built with these bad loans and they're left totally unoccupied. So there's absolutely no revenues being generated by any of those loans. Now, the way to understand China that I always describe to people is through the population. China has 1.4 billion people, and the vast majority of them are concentrated in cities. The United States has about 360 million people. So that's a 4-to-1 ratio. China has 4 times more people than in the United States. They also have roughly 1/3 the resources of the United States. So try to understand it like this. Imagine that wherever you are right now, you're in front of a camera to Zoom, on a Zoom call right now, but where you might have been today, in an elevator, in a checkout line at a grocery store, in a line at a gas station. Imagine there are 4 times more people there. Imagine there's 4 times more people sitting around whatever table you're at right now. 4 times more people in Starbucks, 4 times more people on every street corner, every crosswalk. And now imagine all of you, 4 times more, are all competing for 1/3 the amount of stuff that we currently have. And that's the situation in China. And that's why the Communist Party is so concerned with getting resources around the world. Their social contract with the populace is basically to provide conditions for a prosperous middle class. But we're talking about a middle class out of 1.4 billion people. If they fail to do that, they risk massive unrest. They totally lose legitimacy, and they may even lose power. And this is the mentality that makes up China's massive need to expand internationally and draw resources from around the world. And that's why it deploys this comprehensive, coordinated, whole of government influence campaign, which relies heavily on disinformation, to convince the world that they are a benign, positive, and non-interventionist power. And that's because it's the exact opposite, and they're precisely the game plan they're trying to cover up. So for the Communist Party, it's an existential issue. It's a zero-sum game. And that's what we're going to see more of in the future. And that's why disinformation plays such a big role for as part of Chinese national strategy. Now on Iran, this is a pretty sad story. Not like the others were too uplifting, actually. But by the Cold War, the U.S. ties with Iran because of its economic potential as an oil producer were strong. Their location has made them a strong ally against the Soviet Union. And during the Cold War, Washington and other Western powers backed the Shah Pahlavi, in his efforts to consolidate his rule. But the Shah was forced to flee during a national uprising in 1952, and Iran's nationalist leader, Dr. Mossadegh, came back. He had previously been in power. He was restored to office. Mossadegh planned to nationalize the oil industry, though. And so Western powers assisted in reestablishing the Shah back to power. There's a lot of documentation on what happened back then, perhaps not the proudest moment for Western foreign policy, but it's history and it did happen. So in 1979, the Iranian people kind of rose up against the next Shah, and because of excesses and because of the Shah's crackdown on popular uprisings, and the Iranian people ended up toppling that monarchy. Now, there was a vacuum, a power vacuum for a couple of weeks, and a reactionary religious cleric, Ayatollah Khomeini, took advantage of that power vacuum and usurped leadership of the revolution, but it was not heading in that direction at the time. And to consolidate his regime, the Ayatollah supported a takeover of the US Embassy in Tehran. They took 52 American diplomats held hostage, kept them there for over a year. The US retaliated by freezing Iranian accounts, and they severed diplomatic relations. And then in the 1980s, the Iran and Iraq war took place. Iran was on the losing side of that. It was a very bloody war. The Iranian regime also created proxy militia groups in Lebanon, such as Hezbollah, and in Iraq and everywhere and other places. And that was consistent with their policy of exporting Islamic revolution. And through the 1990s, the US designated the Iranian regime as the most active sponsor of terror for fomenting terrorist activities and supporting Shiite militant groups. And by 1995, the US imposed sanctions on Iran. In 1997, a new president came to power, Khatami, and the US eased some of the sanctions as a gesture of goodwill, mistakenly believing that the regime would moderate its behavior, and that didn't happen. The regime didn't moderate its behavior, they doubled down. And so tensions continued to rise. In 2005, President Ahmadinejad of Iran worsened relations by denying Israel's nationhood. By 2008, the US had renewed sanctions with international support, and this was because Iran at this point had gotten very far down the road of developing the ability to create a nuclear weapon and actually launch it somewhere. And in 2010, the UN piled on, and they also approved crippling penalties against Iran. So new president, 2013, President Rouhani, he continued policies pursued by his predecessors that relate to support for the Syria's or Assad regime, lots of human rights abuses inside of Iran, and the development and the proliferation of ballistic missiles continued. In 2015, the Obama administration and other countries, the US, the UK, France, China, Russia, and Germany, tried to get Iran to enter into a long-term deal. It was called the P5+1 deal, and to stop to cease their nuclear programs in exchange for the lifting of sanctions. Iran agreed. They did, for a time, cease the nuclear activities. They allowed international inspectors in, but they didn't, and they got the sanctions lifted. And in the end, however, they didn't honor the agreement completely, and they used the opportunity and the money that they gained from lifting sanctions to continue to support terrorism and instability in the region and around the world. So in May 2018, the United States pulled out of the nuclear deal. We reinstated economic sanctions against Iran. We threatened to do the same thing to other countries and firms. It continued to buy its oil, and Iran fell into deep recession. And relationship between the United States and Iran has worsened since May 2019. The U.S. has tightened the sanctions targeting Iran's oil exports, and Iran started a counter-pressure campaign in which we believe there's evidence that they exploded at least 6 oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman, and then in retaliation, in January of 2020, Iran's top military commander, General Soleimani, was killed by the U.S. drone strike in Iraq. And Iran has vowed severe revenge for his death, and that's kind of where we are right now. So that's not a very pretty picture. But Iran uses disinformation in support of their actions in the region. They consistently target the United States as well as Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states. And their false narratives have evolved with COVID-19 spread, and they often converge with disinformation propagated by China and Russia. We see them actually either learning from or being taught by Russia on how to develop disinformation to continue to try to achieve their goals of total dominance in the region. So those are some of the issues that that make up what it is that we are doing with these 3 countries and why they react to us the way they do and how they see themselves and their role in the world. I'm not sure how long I went right now, but I think the agreement was to go for 35 minutes and then take questions. I think I probably went over that time, but I'll stop right now and I'll take a few questions about that. But what I want to say before we go into that is that I am a State Department official still. I work for the State Department, and the role of the State Department is not to be involved in, we do not get involved in domestic affairs. Our role is to be involved in foreign affairs. So I won't be answering any questions about domestic politics or talking about either of the candidates or the election or anything like that. But I will talk about US policy overseas and about disinformation and how that relates to it. So with that, I guess maybe someone wants to moderate questions, or I'm just happy to answer them as they come up.
Yeah, I'm happy to moderate. If you have any questions, just raise your hand, or if you're not comfortable with sharing yourself, you can just put it in the chat and I will read it out for you.
There are absolutely no wrong questions.
Okay, David Cross has raised his hand. Let's see if I can get him allowed to talk. Okay, go ahead, David.
Hi there. Quick question just about Putin. I've heard that he has actually pressured a lot of the oligarchs into sharing a lot of their wealth that they get. And so that's actually made Putin a really rich guy. Have you heard that too?
Yeah, that's kind of the way it works. It's like a criminal mafia where everybody has to kick up whatever you make in order to have the right to stay in power. It's got the most effective and most powerful police force in the country are the tax police. So imagine the IRS has a SWAT team that comes down your house if you don't pay your taxes. That's what Putin's got. And they will raid oligarchs' offices if they don't kick in the funds that have been asked for. Now, Putin doesn't actually make the phone call himself. He also has his own political ecosystem where that kind of thing works. But it's understood that if you want to thrive in Putin's Russia, then you have to pay him.
Interesting. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, and then we have 2 questions from Adam. Okay, so he says, Mr. O'Brien, I've seen both Russia and China built like a house of cards, and we're possibly coming to a nadir. My 2 questions are this: what happens to Russia in a post-Putin world following his active efforts in global disinformation? Will other nations be willing to help develop Russia? This broad question also applies to China and their expansionist behavior. Can the Chinese government recover from their damaging warfare diplomacy and try to help them to continue to develop?
Okay. That got broken up towards the end, but I did hear the first part of it, the Putin part. So I'll answer the question about Russia, and then maybe you can repeat the part about China. Or I don't know, maybe I can even see it in the chat. But with Russia, you know, after 1990, there was a lot of hope for Russia. A lot of countries invested in there. You saw a lot of foreign direct investment. You saw a lot of entrepreneurship. There are a lot of horror stories of investments going wrong, people being just basically ripped off, people being threatened, business partners, foreign business partners being threatened to leave the country. There's a famous case with Subway sandwiches in St. Petersburg. Even BP and Shell Oil had some of their fields that they were developing in Siberia nationalized. So there's, if Putin's Russia does collapse, or if that economy collapses, or if there's need for help, there will be lessons learned. The people that got involved in that are still alive and involved in politics and business today. Those lessons have been learned, and there will be greater concessions that are going to have to be made, and greater assurances are going to have to be made before anyone again invests in Russia. The Russian people, are smart, they're hardworking, and they want to live, and they basically want what all the rest of us want, which is to raise our families and to prosper and to live happily. And there is definite potential there, but the problem is that there is not really a government as we see it that serves the people, and there is not a system of law that exists that serves the people. The laws exist and the police forces exist to serve the wealthy and serve the powerful at the expense of those who are not. Now, until those kinds of things change, I don't think there's going to be much excitement to invest big, in a large way in Russia. Now, if you could perhaps ask that question again about China.
Yeah. So he said, this broad question also applies to China and their expansionist behavior. Can the Chinese government recover from their damaging wolf warrior diplomacy and attract allies to help them to continue to develop?
Well, China's always played this game where they say we're a developing nation because you won't say that we're developed. And so therefore, we don't have to play the same rules as a developed nation. Developed nations should be more leaders in the world economy and versus, takers or from the world economy. They've been doing this for a long time, but I think in real terms, in economic terms, in the aggregate, they're considered to be a developed economy at this point. They just simply developed in a way that they left a few things behind in their speed to get there. So they've got they've got a fantastic road and housing and industrial infrastructure, but their healthcare system is completely left behind. Their waterways are totally polluted to the point where they couldn't even possibly, get enough water from inside the country to fuel or to give them fresh water for people to use. They have to actually import water. They have no natural gas. They have to import that from other parts of the world. And so I think that they have a lot of energy issues. And a lot of that has come from their desire to develop super quickly. That is really going to be China's responsibility to catch up and fill in the gaps that they left behind in this process to get there. One thing you can say about the Chinese economy is that it does have great potential. We have always said the United States and other countries welcome the peaceful rise of China, and that stands true. We're not trying to hold them back, but if China uses the wealth that they gain to try to continue to impose their will on others, and I think their claiming of the entire South China Sea as their own their own territory is a perfect example of that. If they're going to continue to do that kind of thing, I think they're not going to really get a lot of humanitarian and benign help from the rest of the world. They're probably going to get more pushback than not. I don't see China really actually reaching out for a lot of help. I see them perhaps using the sentiment of needing help in order to maybe achieve some other nefarious gain.
Thank you. Now I'm going to allow Lizzie to talk. If you want to ask your question.
Hey there.
Yes, hi. I was just curious, with over the past few years, people becoming more like social media savvy and the general knowledge that these sort of disinformation campaigns exist kind of growing, if you've seen the success rates change or if you feel like they've changed tactics at all in using them now that that information is kind of out there?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a really good question. it's easy to change tactics. It's easy to change places. It's easy to change. All you have to do is make up a lie. You don't have to. It doesn't have to be substantiated in any way. It used to be that the ecosystem is such that in the beginning, a perfect example would be the country of Slovakia. I just spent last year. I spent about 5 weeks there working with the Slovak government to counter disinformation in the lead up to their elections. And one of the things that we found in Slovakia is that 5 years previous, you would go in there and you'd find that there was a proliferation of foreign disinformation sources working domestically inside the Slovak information space. By the time we got there, we would look at these disinformation sources and you might find one for every 50 domestic disinformation source. So there might, for every 50 websites or stories you looked at, only one of them originated from Russia. The rest of them were internal. And that's because Russia has succeeded in creating an ecosystem where proxy sites and supporters inside certain countries do their business for them. They simply have to listen for a signal from the Kremlin with maybe one disinformation story, and then they're off to the races, and they create that and they proliferate it inside their own country. This is something that we've seen in various countries. We've seen it in, it's starting to actually happen in Latin America as well, in Venezuela and in Bolivia. Russia has major nuclear interests, and they've created a disinformation system where they have proxy sites. They're actually Bolivian sites. And so now if you're the Bolivian government, you've got a problem with limiting free speech because they're your own domestic sites. The same thing's happening in the United States. So this is some of the things that they're doing. Something else they do is cyber attacks. You'll often see a cyber attack that is consistent with a disinformation campaign that follows right afterwards. So there was in the elections in North Macedonia just a few months ago, right as the North Macedonian Elections Commission was about to publish the results of the election, which were contested and in which a pro-Western party was actually going to come into power. Right as that happened, their website crashed completely. And it's because we found out that it was a Russian source. They flooded the website with requests and it crashed it completely. And so then other websites started putting out information that said that the election was stolen by this pro-Western party. Totally untrue. Eventually the dust settled and they were able to get back on track. But that was something that's unprecedented. We hadn't seen that before, where right at the moment where an election result was about to be published, the entire grid was shut down. So these are some of the things that they do, and they'll continue to do these as artificial information, as data analytics, and as machine learning continues to get better. But we just do the same thing. They get better at disinformation. We get better at detecting it. And we do employ lots and lots of technology in this process. AI, it's impossible to do this without artificial intelligence. It's impossible to do this without machine learning because there aren't enough eyeballs in the world to scrape the internet, to watch this and keep on top of it. You've got to use technology, and we're the best in the world at creating that technology. So thanks for the question.
Okay, so I'm going to read one now. This is from Eric McLean. He says, do these regimes also target states such as Saudi Arabia or Turkey with disinformation campaigns?
Yeah, they do. They absolutely do. They don't just target, the United States, Japan, Western Europe. They target everywhere. Anywhere where there's an interest, anywhere where the instability can be created that takes our resources, takes everyone's resources away from trying to move the ball forward and trying to get it back up to zero, that's where they target. So they're targeting right now because there are an incredible number of, there are peace deals in the Middle East. I mean, it's historic peace deals in the Middle East where countries you never would have thought of are recognizing Israel's right to exist. With that, various other promises, to create stability in the Middle East. You see Iran and Russia targeting those countries and targeting those leaders and targeting Saudi Arabia for these reasons. And I think the thing is, politics is a messy business, so you can always find something wrong that the other guy did. But in the aggregate, if the if the organization or if the country is moving in a positive direction, we tend to accept that and say, okay, well, some bad things might happen, but it's better than total chaos. But that's not what the other side wants. Russia and China want total chaos. Well, Russia wants total chaos and Iran wants total chaos because they don't want any of this to move forward. All of those peace deals in the Middle East are clearly a reaction to Iran's increasing attempts to maintain or to gain dominance in the region. So hopefully that answered the question.
Thank you. Now there's two more who have their hands raised. Okay, Braden, do you want to go?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Mr. O'Brien. Thanks for coming in today to talk with us. I'm a third-year law student. I've got kind of two questions for you. So first, I hope this is within the scope of foreign policy, but how do you see platform liability, Facebook, Twitter, Google, interacting with foreign actors such as the IRA in Russia and other, like the Macedonian misinformation groups that we saw in the 2016 election? How do you view our interaction with foreign actors trying to influence the American media sphere?
Yeah, we talk to them. We have a weekly call with C-suite, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Google. We talk to them all the time. That relationship was at one point, they weren't sure to trust us. We weren't sure to trust them. I found it to be ironic that we actually hired someone, the Global Engagement Center here in Washington, D.C., hired a guy and sent him out to the Bay Area to live and to work closely on a daily basis with all of the social media companies. Now, that really kind of sounds like what normally opposite happens. You're an industry and you want to work with Washington. So you hire someone and send them to Washington, you call them a lobbyist. We almost, because those industries are so huge and have been unregulated for so long, the US government has literally hired a lobbyist to go out and lobby them. And it's something that started off not so great in the beginning because there was some mistrust. And I think that there was a whole lot of misunderstanding on the part of some in the US government as well. But it's eventually, we've built a relationship such that we'll present to them something that the IRA has put out, or we'll present to them something that Stormfront or some other proxy Russian site has put out there, and they'll take action on it because they actually know and they realize, yeah, this is not, this is disinformation. It's appearing on our site, and our average people who are paying us advertising revenues are getting their ads showing up on these sites, and I'm sure they wouldn't be too happy to know about that either, for that to happen. So I see it as, it's the social media industry doesn't want to give up its, sovereignty. In some ways, they're sovereign nations, but they also don't want to get regulated. And it's embarrassing to get regulated if you can't figure out how to regulate yourself. And it's they've created these behemoths that they themselves can't entirely control on a regular basis. Any policy that they create will harm some and help others. So I think that moving forward, dialogue with them, working with them, and a kind of whole of government, whole of nation response is going to help the social media industry develop itself in such a way that free speech is protected, but malign actors don't get to use it to their advantage the way they have been in the past.
Yeah, great. And my second kind of prong on that is you brought up artificial intelligence and the automated algorithms, these new technologies that we're seeing. What sort of risk do you see inherent in the rise of deep fakes, more synthetic media, as these technologies become more widely available and commercially available?
Huge. It's a huge threat. We have entire chunks of our organization looking at deep fakes and how to deal with them. Deep fakes, for those of you who are not aware of it, is basically you can create a photograph or you can create a video that looks very real with a real person in it that is completely not real. You can put their face on. It's not. The Russians have been doing this for generations, where they would remove people from photos or add people to photos to prove that a certain thing happened or didn't happen. And this is just basically like a high-tech way of doing things like that. It's going to be a major issue. We don't have a solution to it yet, but I can tell you that private industry, the intelligence community, the diplomatic community, and the domestic, law enforcement communities are working very closely to try to find a way to approach this, and it will have some effects. We probably won't be able to get it all, but it'll have some effects in the future. I think really what it boils down to is, there's no one answer. There will be disinformation. There will be successful disinformation, but practicing, and this comes from the individual, although we ought to teach it as well in schools, but practicing being able to use critical thinking skills as to what you're reading and whether you act on it or not, or where do you go to look at other sources to confirm it, is something that we haven't done. We all say, hey, I saw it on the internet, it must be true. I mean, we laugh at that, but there is a certain degree of belief in that. Or my friend sent it to me, he wouldn't tell me something that's not true, but he might not know the difference. And so that's just going to be where, it's really going to come down to, does the individual practice, critical thinking skills? And perhaps we need to start learning more of those.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Okay. I'm going to read just one more and then save the rest of these questions for our second Q&A session, if that's okay with you. Okay, so this is from Sam Romano. He says, do you think there's value in repositioning the United States' own cyber-based activity to a more offensive posture to counter disinformation, or is fighting fire with fire risky in the long run?
So you mean, should we get into disinformation ourselves?
I think that's what they're getting at.
Let's see. Do you think, okay, I'll read it. Repositioning the United States' own cyber-based activity to more offensive posture. Yeah, it's a really informed question, actually. There is some sense of becoming more offensive in nature, but not to create disinformation, but more to get, I'd say, more pointy, create a little bit more of a kinetic result against those who proliferate to disinformation, like shutting down their websites, crashing their sites, and hacking into them and manipulating them in such a way that they can't actually put out the disinformation, sanctions on individuals. Dmitry Prigozhin is basically the Putin chef. You might have heard of him. He runs, not directly, he's no longer a chairman of it, but he runs the Internet Research Agency, which is primarily responsible for most of what happened in terms of Russian disinformation during our 2016 elections. He's been sanctioned. Others around him have been sanctioned. And there's, obviously things I'm not going to go into, but you can imagine we're building the kind of cyber capabilities to be able to counter the cyber attacks and the cyber hacks that took place in the past. But what we're not going to do is engage in disinformation ourselves. When we go low like that, there's no coming back from it. We simply don't. I've been doing this for years, and that's not something that we engage in ourselves, because at that point you lose all credibility. You have to be a source of truth. Otherwise, you can't possibly expect anyone to believe you. When you claim that the other side is lying.
Thank you. Okay, so everyone else whose questions we didn't get to, we will get to in the second set of Q&As. I'm going to turn it back over to you, Mr. O'Brien, so you can finish up your lecture. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just going to talk maybe for about 15 minutes about what the Global Engagement Center does. And I'm telling you that so that you understand that, I read a lot in the news about how we're not doing anything about disinformation, or not doing enough about disinformation, and it's hard to understand. First of all, news stories, they exist, to push a certain line so that they increase revenues. Don't fault them on that. And secondly, it's hard to understand what we do, and in a lot of ways, it's kind of boring. So I don't expect anyone to want to go and try to find out and read about it. But I will explain to you, I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that we are focused on this. The US government recognizes this an issue. This administration funds and supports it. And so did the last administration eventually. Finally, it did. But we know it's an issue. We know it's coming. We know that we have been behind on this for a while. We know it's easy to destroy and hard to create. So we have a real work cut out for us. But the GEC, this Global Engagement Center, this interagency organization, is totally focused on identifying disinformation and making sure that it's exposed and helping partners around the world to do something about it. So let's talk a little bit about the GEC. So following the 2016 elections, the US government recognized that we were under threat from foreign influence in the digital media space and that they were attacking elections. And as part of that effort, the Global Engagement Center came into being. There had originally been an effort to have a presence on social media to counter ISIS and Al-Qaeda recruiting, but that expanded and we created what we call threat teams. There's 4 of them now. There's the old counterterrorism threat team, but now there's a Russia, China, and Iran threat team. There's also something called A&R, Analytics and Research Team, and they basically employ IA, data analytics, and classic intel analysis and machine learning, and they go out and work with the private sector to buy services or products to help go out and identify this disinformation. We have a technology engagement team that works closely with Silicon Valley, and they're working closely with us to try to get in front of all of this. And we see ourselves, the Global Engagement Center, our main job is to lead and coordinate the US government's efforts to recognize, expose, and counter foreign disinformation that's aimed at undermining our stability, our allies' stability, and the stability of the democracies and free markets worldwide. We work with the entire interagency, everyone that's involved in this, law enforcement, intelligence, special operations, military special operations. That's how I came to be into this, and the diplomatic corps. We coordinate with international partners all over the place. We have partnerships in South America, partnerships with countries and civil society across Europe. We're starting to partner in Africa because that's where Russia's going and that's where China is active now. Like I said, we leverage the private sector. We develop civil society. One of our best partners out there are civil society groups, people that volunteer their time or work for very little money to try to expose disinformation that's focused on destabilizing their countries. We work with them. We provide them with grants. We provide them with training, and they provide us. We learn from them. We work with the tech industry. We work with the media. There was a question about, how disinformation morphs over time. That's another thing that we do. One of our main efforts is to assess and adjust and to look at where it's going to go next and how can we be out there and ready to react to that. So those are some of the things that we do. The global health pandemic of COVID underscores that serious threat posed by disinformation and propaganda campaigns. And as a result, I think I've talked about it. We've worked with we've worked with civil society, local influencers, journalists, and the like. And we've been successful in many ways. Last fall, we worked with other State Department colleagues and with the UK, the United Kingdom, and with Baltic state governments on a joint campaign to celebrate something called the 30th anniversary of what was known as the Baltic Way. That was, I talked about how the Soviet Union fell apart in 1989. Well, in 1989, all 3 Baltic states, that's Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, joined hands from the Gulf of Finland on down to the southern border of Lithuania, and over a 400-kilometer expanse. And that was to demonstrate their solidarity against Soviet occupation. That was called the Baltic Way. The 30th anniversary of that was last year. It was a milestone. And we celebrated that by recreating the Baltic Way human chain. That human chain had a hashtag. That hashtag was picked up by democracy proponents in Hong Kong and went worldwide. And so why is this important? Because at the same time that this was happening, Russia was putting out a raft of disinformation about how the Baltic Way and the fall of the Soviet Union has led to an untold misery. Well, that campaign flooded the information space with positive stories and positive remembrances. And that is one of the ways that you defeat disinformation. The space is out there. It's a vacuum. It's going to be occupied by someone. So if you're active in occupying it with truth-based information, that's important and helps move societies forward. And by the way, societies have to be united and able to do this. Then you can defeat those threats from malign foreign actors. So that was something that is one of those great successes. Another great success was a report that we just wrote. Like I said, I led the Russia team's efforts for the last year or so, maybe a little longer, in the Global Engagement Center. I'm now in the process of retiring. I've had enough of it. But we put together something called Russia's 5 Pillars of Disinformation. That is a report, first ever report, that actually goes in and examines the entire ecosystem of Russian disinformation and calls it out and basically backed it up with deep research to prove our points. Now, the report was picked up worldwide. Presidents mentioned it in their speeches. 22 international, major international newspapers covered it. The day that we put the report out, journalists, civil society members have been calling off the hook, asking for more information on how to learn how to counter disinformation as a result of this report. But for me, the number one measure of success was that how badly the Russian government discounted the report. Because in politics, as we all know, you never believe anything until it's publicly denied. But the Russian government absolutely stormed us and attacked us for putting out this report, and they launched an entire campaign targeting my team, myself, and others, and our special envoy who's in charge of the group for doing this, and the U.S. government writ large. That tells me, obviously, we were on to the right things. So the report basically talks about these 5 different pillars. There's official government communication. That's usually spin and propaganda. Then there's state-funded global messaging, like RT, Sputnik, and other state-funded newspapers and broadcast news outlets and the like, and digital news outlets. There's another area, it's cultivation of proxy sources. I've talked about this before. These are fake. These are sources that claim they are not connected to the Russian government, but they're actually Russian intelligence operations. There's weaponization of social media. That's people getting onto social media chats and saying irresponsible things like, Black Lives Matter is a terrorist organization, or, if you support the president, you're nothing, you're hate, you're a racist. And then suddenly an argument ensues. There was actually an incident in New York in 2016 where the Proud Boys, considered a white nationalist or white supremacist group, and Black Lives Matter did not realize that either group was actually having a protest in New York City, didn't even know it. But a Russian intelligence operation was able to get the two of them arguing with each other in social media, and they ended up in a clash on the street that they would otherwise not be in because of Russian intelligence operations. So that's the kind of thing that's happening. Now, it may very well be that you have an opinion about each group that is a negative opinion, but those groups did not go to New York City looking for a fight. They went there looking for a protest. They ended up in a clash because they were manipulated by Russian intelligence. So there's a lot of what they have been doing, the Russians have been doing, and the Chinese have been doing around COVID. I think I've talked a lot about that. But basically they've used COVID as not just, they've converged actually where they actually repeat each other's lines and strengthen each other's lines. It's almost, we go back to the point where a Russian proxy site started the lie that the United States created COVID as a bioweapon, which then eventually made its way throughout the social media system into China, and it was eventually picked up by and spoken by a Chinese official. This is this disinformation convergence and this disinformation ecosystem that we see forming. And it's formed around our elections and other elections too. I won't talk about our elections, but everything I say about foreign elections, you can guarantee it's happening inside our own country. We pass that information that we get on to the Department of Homeland Security and to the Department of Justice, and they deal with that. Let's see, but there's a lot I could say about that report. You can Google it, it's out there, Russia's 5 Pillars of Disinformation. I can't send it to you because we are bound by law not to not be able to lobby domestic audiences, but it's something that's worth reading. And you can go to the Global Engagement Center's website, and there's lots and lots of information out there that is open to be read about disinformation and how it affects all of you. I think honestly, where are we at? We're at 2:15. There were a lot of questions. Why don't we just stop? We're almost at 2:15. I'd like to stop here because I know there were some good questions, and I can just go on and on at length, but about the pillars of Russian disinformation and Russian and Chinese media and how they are using COVID and using elections to destabilize us. But I'm pretty sure everyone's got the point here. Why don't we go back to some more questions?
Sounds good. I'm going to start it off with Zach Zimmerman. He has a question. Do you want to go?
Hey there, can you hear me?
Yes, got you, Zach.
Hi, Mr. O'Brien. First
Right.
of all, thank you so much. And thank you to Will. I'm good friends with him. He's in my class. I'm a 1L here at WNL. I can't stress enough how important this information is to be shared with law students and college students here in the States and around the world. I would like it to start even when we're younger. And that, of course, starts with teaching these history lessons fully and truthfully. But that leads me to my question. How cooperative are the different disinformation agencies in these countries working with the education systems as well? And have you looked into that at all over your time?
Oh, you mean disinformation attempting to rewrite history inside those countries?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's something that's always been that way anyway. But disinformation, the government has a distinct interest in mobilizing a population to truly believe their line. I mean, a perfect example of that goes back before we had data analytics and we had digital media and the like. We had any kind of technology before we had mobile phones, before we even had the internet. And that is, Russia used the argument that Germany had invaded it during World War II to mobilize an entire population to believe that the only way to stop that was to invade and occupy all the countries of Central Asia, Central and Eastern Europe, and the Caucasus, right? And so that was how they mobilized these populations to actually believe that what they were doing was keeping Russia safe. That's an old example, but a really, a big and easy one to understand. This is happening all around. I mean, you've got, Chinese education system is completely rewriting it in such a way that the nationalists they don't even exist, in Chinese history lessons. The entire, history of how Mao Zedong came to power is one that glorifies them. The mass starvation is not, no one even knows that it exists. In China, Will can attest to this. We're in the country, you'll be watching, news, and then suddenly the screen will go black. And that's because it's a story that could be perceived as negative against China. So the disinformation apparatus is clearly manipulating domestic audiences with a view towards keeping them calm, keeping them from seeing what problems are happening domestically, and blaming those problems on foreign interests like the United States, foreign governments like the United States and allies. And that is, to keep pressure off of their own governments, and also to be able to mobilize populations to achieve what they want them to achieve. So yeah, it's happening. It'll continue to happen. The best you can do is develop civil society, develop media literacy, develop critical thinking skills. Both provide the ability to do that, and also instill and inculcate in populations their personal responsibility to do so.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go back to reading now. So this is from John Coffrin. He says, can you please elaborate on where Iran had broken the JCPOA? Also, given widespread protests in Iran and further sanctions creating severe economic problems in Iran, what do you think will be the impact on current disinformation projects or other actions of the Iranian government?
Yeah. So yeah, when I said that, I think I might have given off the wrong impression about the JCPOA. It wasn't so much that the Iranians had violated it in any way that we could prove, but I mean, it's hard to go into this without sharing information I shouldn't be. But they used the funding that they gained from the lifting of sanctions to create unrest in other areas. And so as a result, basically violated the spirit of the agreement, because even though they weren't destabilizing with the open development of ballistic missiles, they were destabilizing because the funds that they gained from the lifting of sanctions were not being used to lift up the Iranian people. They were being used to export more chaos in the region. And that is the public answer to that. And the rest of it is, join the government, go through the horrific process of getting a TS clearance, and you'll know the rest of the story. And the part about creating severe economic problems in Iran, it has created severe economic problems in Iran, and it's why sanctions have come on and off over the years, because we are aware that this creates severe economic problems in the country. But our position is that if the Iranian government actually valued stability and taking care of its own people, then they wouldn't be taking these funds and pouring them into creating instability in Syria and Iraq. They would be taking them and building infrastructure. I mean, the Iranian government spends millions upon millions of dollars importing subway systems. Perfect example. But there's no subway, there's no metro system in Iran. So what are those subway systems being used for? What else can you travel around underground in a giant tube, right? Besides people, you can travel, you can take certain strategic military assets around. So these are some of the things that they're doing with the funding that they are gaining from lifting of sanctions. This is the kind of thing that if they were willing to turn this funding towards developing their education system, their healthcare system, their economy, so that their own people could prosper instead of starve and suffer the way they are, then it would be a different story. I think that disinformation projects inside of Iran exist to try to keep the Iranian people believing that their problems come from elsewhere, but they're not really successful. You've seen a lot of protests over the years. The Iranian people are very willing to stand up and confront their government if they can get enough of a quorum of people, so that those who organize it don't all get kind of pulled out into the street and disappeared. They've done it multiple times, and I think that eventually things like this actually will have an effect. I can say, I went back a long time ago, early in this speech, and talked about my time on the East German border. The Berlin Wall came down in November of 1989, early November. I was in East Berlin in the last week of October of 1989. And there was not a single shred of evidence or anything to indicate that there was unrest. And in fact, I was there for 2 days, and on one of those days, a teenager approached the east side in East Berlin, approached the Berlin Wall, got within the 50-meter zone that he wasn't allowed to be within, and he was shot dead by a Russian guard. But then 2 weeks later, the entire city rushed the wall and literally pulled it down with sledgehammers and bulldozers in their own hands. So protests, so things can happen like that. And no one predicted it. The CIA didn't predict it. MI6 couldn't predict it. Germany didn't predict it. The Soviets, the Russians certainly didn't predict it. It just happened like wildfire. And the Chinese and the Iranians are very aware that this kind of thing can take place, and they watch it very closely. But when it does happen, sometimes it gets to be so great that you can't stop it. So I do believe that that is a possibility, because I've seen it with my own eyes in my own lifetime.
Thank you so much. And then we just have 2 more questions, one of them being Will's, so I'm going to save that one for last. This one is from Adam again. He says, Mr. O'Brien, do you have suggestions moving forward to combat these propaganda and disinformation methods by these malign actors?
Do you mean for yourself or for governments? And maybe you could type that in, he's probably listening.
Yeah. I guess, and while he's typing that, then we can do Will's question. Will says, ranking amongst the 3 state actors, how have they focused on suppressing internal dissent, contrasted with dissent from defectors abroad? Are there similar techniques across the 3 actors in question?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So China is sending students out all over the world, especially the United States and Western Europe, to study. Those students, many of them are actually acting on behalf of the Chinese government. They're actually Chinese government agents. Others are not. And what they find is that these students are being monitored, their social media, their communications home, the social media and the type of news that they actually watch by Chinese agents in these countries. So what I mean is, you got Chinese students in your school coming from China studying engineering. There are Chinese agents these are Chinese students, right? There are Chinese agents also posing as students, also operating in the country, who are watching those students and intimidating them to stay off of certain media sites, and intimidating them based on what they say, intimidating them to actually say things in support of the PRC. That's something we know that's happening. There's the Confucius societies, the Confucius inside of the many schools around the country. Chinese are actually using those to whitewash their own history and to present a very benign version of China's rise and intentions in the world. At the same time, because I spent time in China, I ran a public affairs section in Guangzhou, which is a part of the country with 500 million people in it. At the same time, the Chinese government is not allowing the United States to even show films in high schools or in colleges around China. Anyone that actually meets with an American official at what we call American corners, which are these little cultural corners that are at universities, in Chinese universities inside of China. Anyone who actually goes to those are harassed, and most of them have been shut down. Most of the cultural activities that we have attempted to try in China to talk about American culture have basically been blocked by the Chinese government. But they, on the other hand, operate these Confucius centers here in the United States. So I would say that a lot of times what they do is they harass, intimidate dissidents, and they manage students so closely overseas that the students are afraid to do anything, and they do it through threatening, loss of, threatening their families back at home, or it's just plain scary to be visited by, an intelligence officer and told to do what you're, told to toe the line. Russia does it entirely different. Well, Russia does it differently. Russia doesn't care so much about what their students say overseas, mostly because they don't have many of them. And but they talk about political dissidents. They have interest in what political dissidents do overseas and even in their own country. I mean, Anna Politkovskaya was one of the modern heroes. She was a journalist, one of my main contacts when I was in the political section at Embassy Moscow. She was shot dead right in front of her family on Putin's birthday. So that's how the Russians deal with things. They poison your tea, or there's all kinds of other accidents that don't actually make the news, but they do it through sheer intimidation. And that was my experience there. The Russians are about physical intimidation. I was knocked off the road in my car, attacked several times. The Chinese do it through kind of psychological intimidation. And the Iranians kind of fall in line with the way the Russians do things. So, but it's real, it's out there, and they're doing it to us. They target us.
Thank you. Okay, so back to Adam. He expanded. He said that his question, or he just rewrote, he said, Mr. O'Brien, how can truth penetrate self-contained ecosystems such as these information bubbles like Weibo, WeChat, or even Facebook? It does appear that if anyone enters the bubble, it is very difficult to escape.
Yeah, that's another really good, I want to say there's been some really good and informed questions here, which is encouraging. We sit in our own bubble there in State Department, and there's the centrifugal pull of the bureaucracy. You don't even know what other people know about there. But the questions that are being asked, that question and several others, demonstrate that you're clearly you recognize where the important issues are. That is a problem. How do you get it penetrate internal discussions in WeChat and Weibo and even in Facebook? Facebook, they'll do it. They will actually police. Obviously, Weibo, WeChat, they're not going to do that. You know, you can escape the bubble. You just simply suffer the wrath if you're a citizen inside that country. I think what it really comes down to is that, you know, having a choice of systems on which to communicate is important so that you can move from system to system. I don't think social media is going to go away. I don't think these internal, you know, chats are going to go away. Once again, it really, you're violating, you know, freedom of speech by attempting to infiltrate an internal chat, and we're not going to get involved in something like that, not unless it, you know, it presents a clear and present danger, and even then, that's a law enforcement operation. That wouldn't even be an intelligence or, you know, diplomatic operation. But that is, you know, if there was actually a crime that was going to be committed. The best way to combat that is, again, for people to understand and, you know, to practice critical thinking, to understand that they're being manipulated, and to know when it's time to leave a chat, and even if they do have friends in that chat, and, you know, and leave certain groups like that. I've eliminated WeChat from my phone. Well, actually, no, I threw the phone out because I knew I was never going to fix it. But I deleted WeChat and other things from my phone for that reason. And I think that's really what you can do right now. And the only other thing you can do is make sure that there are truth-based alternatives that are out there for us, and promote them. I think one thing I want to say before, I think we're getting to the end of the conversation here. One thing I wanted to say is that, you know, this exists in the political and the social realm right now, but mostly in the political and security realm right now, disinformation. It's just a matter of time, and I think that time is coming where it jumps the tracks and starts to become a weapon for the private sector. And if you're law students that are going to be out there interpreting law and intellectual property and other types of law, like First Amendment law, or others, or corporate law, corporations are going to become victims of this kind of thing as well. You know, China wants to buy US companies, and they want to buy them cheap. And they want to buy US companies that don't want to be sold. So a little bit of disinformation that crashes the stock price or creates some type of a threat for the CEO, and then instability in the company, is a great thing, actually, if your desire is to buy something cheap, or to buy the technology, get your hands on technology you wouldn't normally have. Russia does the same thing. They practice this kind of thing in Africa and in Central America, and to a degree in Central and Eastern Europe. So you will see that coming in your careers, where disinformation is going to be a problem for corporations as well, because it'll be a threat to their reputations and a threat to, you know, their share price and the value they provide shareholders. So that's something to look at down the road. I certainly am.
Well, thank you so much for being here and giving us all this information, and also taking the time to answer everyone's questions. I know I personally really appreciate it and found this incredibly interesting and engaging, and I'm sure everyone else listening on did as well. So on behalf of GLJ and WNL Law, thank you so much for coming here. And if anyone has any final questions, please feel free to ask them. It doesn't look like anyone does. So again, thank you so much for being here. This was truly a pleasure.
Sounds great. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to make sure this information gets out there. It's important. It affects us all, and we are all in this together. So thanks for your time. Thanks for your interest, and good luck to you in your futures.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Bye now.
Bye.